In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove the steering system from the Pro Angler 12 or Pro Angler 14 360 boats. And this could be to replace a steering crank or a damaged belt, any number of different things that you would need to remove the whole steering system to replace. So I'm just going to go through all the steps. And as far as tools, it's really helpful to have some T-handle hex keys, a 7/64, a 5/32, and a 3/16 you'd need for this, as well as a 5/32 small hex for undoing the bolts on the inside of the well, and a couple of screwdrivers and things like that. So I'll just get started. First step, I'm going to remove the seat, give myself some more access. Then I'm going to go ahead and pull the well out. There's 3 bolts holding the well in. 2 front ones are 3/16 and the back one is a 5/32 hex. And then 2 more bolts here, which are both 5/32 that hold the clutch to the well. You're going to have to undo all of those. This is where the small hex key comes in handy because it's easier to turn inside here. Just go ahead and undo these until you can pull them all the way out. Once you have these 3 completely loosened and those 2 removed, you can pull the well up. You may find that the well catches on the bottom of the clutch here, and it's helpful just to take one of these T-handles and just pop that edge over, and then there's a chance that this gear will catch. Just press on that with your thumb, and then the well easily pulls out. Put it to the side. Next step is to remove the clutch. So you just twist this slightly out, and then pull down, and this assembly comes off. Now you're going to want to remove these 2 7/64 hexes from these clamshell pieces. When you take this apart, there's 2 small pulley wheels in there and 2 small axles for the pulley wheels. Just make sure you don't lose any of those parts as it comes off, because they can fall out. Okay, I'm just going to lift this piece up from the top. Here's those 2 pulley wheels and the shafts. Go ahead and just press all this down, out of the way. Put those aside. Now you can just take this gear out and remove it. Next step, I'm going to take this compression tube spacer, this thin metal piece, and I'm going to pull it out, bend it just slightly to get it out, and I'm going to put that aside. Next step, we're going to remove the steering handles. To remove the 360 handle, go ahead and take a razor blade, just get it under the edge of the sticker, put that sticker aside for now. Then you're going to need to remove this. This is a 1/8 hex. Remove the screw and put it aside. Once that's out, you can just pull up on this handle and it'll come off. And then pull this pin out from the side. And then to remove this handle, you just pull up. After that, you're going to have to remove the H-rail. There's 1 1/4-inch hex at the back. Once you've removed that, there are 2 screws holding this handle mount on. Once they're unscrewed, just remove those completely and put them aside. Now this whole handle, if you pull out on these pieces, you'll be able to lift this piece out, put it aside, and then you'll be able to pull up on this and just twist it to the side to give yourself room to work. Last step is 1 more 1/4 inch hex to remove this handle mount. Now these are free. For the next step, you're going to want to open the rectangular hatch, and there'll be a foam block here. Remember where they are, but pop them out of the kayak to get access to the steering assembly. There's 1 more piece of foam that can make it difficult to get the steering system out, and these 2 screws are holding it into the gunnel. So if you just go ahead and back those screws out, you'll then be able to slide that piece of foam out of the gunnel. You're going to need to release the steering lines from the left crank. So to create some slack, you can release the boa and then reach in, find where the loop on the steering line goes around the crank, and release the front and back steering lines. Before you can remove the compression tube and the steering assembly, you're going to have to undo 1 more hex key, and it's located inside the hull where the compression tube attaches to the steering assembly box. You just need to loosen it a couple turns until the compression tube is able to twist and rotate away from the box. Go ahead and pull that compression tube, push it out so it's sitting inside of the well. Now that the compression tube is separate from the steering box, you can reach in, grab the steering box and crank, and pull, and release them from the boat. This is where the steering line's attached to the steering crank. And this is the hex you had to release to allow the compression tube to come out of the steering box. To remove the compression tube, push it back into the kayak, pull on it from the inside of the kayak, and then to get it out, just slide it out towards the front of the kayak. The steering assembly is made up of the steering box, which has the belt coming out of it, the rudder crank, which slides over the 360 crank, and then these 2 aluminum pieces. This is the compression tube, and this is the compression tube spacer. It's important that you put these parts in the right way around because the ends of them are different. On the end of the compression tube that attaches to the steering box, there is an angled cut. And what that allows is for twisting this to increase or decrease the length of the system, which tensions the belt. So you have to make sure that that angled cut is lined up to go into the steering box. The compression tube spacer has notches at both ends, but the notches on the end where the steering box assembles to it are longer. So make sure that the longer notched end goes into the steering box. Once you have everything disassembled, depending on what you're replacing, whether it was the steering box and belt or the rudder crank, go ahead and put the new parts together, and then put your fingers on the belt and making sure it doesn't twist, run your fingers to the end of the belt, and then you can put the steering box down. Next step is to take the compression tube spacer and making sure you have the end with the smaller notch, because this is going to be on the front of the boat. The end with the larger notch is going to go by the steering box. So the end with the smaller notch, you just place between the ends of the belt, and then you can use that to guide the belt through the compression tube. And remember, you want the end that has the angled cut to be near the steering box. So that's the part you want to slide on first. And then just making sure nothing twists as you slide the belt and the compression tube spacer into the compression tube. All right, now this is going to be ready to install into the boat. You leave this so that you can insert the whole system into the boat like this, and then you're going to want to find the hole for the compression tube in the well, push it out through the well, and then the next step is going to be taking these cranks and getting them through the hole in the gunnel. So first step is to take the system with the crank pointing towards the stern of the boat, feed it in. You're going to want to make sure that the rudder crank doesn't fall off the steering box as you pull it back forwards towards the front of the boat. Find the hole here. There we go. That's it. Then I'm going to go ahead and reach the steering box and the rudder crank and pull this forwards. Okay. Now next step is to try to line up this crank with this hole. And that worked well. Sometimes I find it can be useful to take the end of a Phillips head screwdriver to help feed it through, but it wasn't a problem this time. Now that I have this up, I need to take the compression tube and press it back into the steering box. So you can do that by reaching in and making sure that the belt is straight as you feed the belt onto the steering box. There we go. Now that the compression tube is fed into the steering box, I can pull forwards on the belt while pulling back on the tube just to make sure everything is snug. And there should be a black line on your compression tube. You'll want to rotate that into the up position. Once you've fed the steering assembly into the kayak, it's good practice just to double check that you haven't done any damage to the compression tube spacer while trying to get the compression tube into the steering box. If you had done damage to the compression tube spacer, this longer section would be kinked here. You'd see that it was out of line, but this one looks nice and straight. So I'm just going to go ahead and feed that back into the compression tube. To do that, I just put it in at a bit of an angle here, feed it in, and then there's a little detent that it'll fit in. You should see just a small amount of, about 1/4 inch of this shoulder sticking out of the compression tube. You know that's seated. Now that you have the steering assembly in the kayak, the next step is to attach the side rail. So you need to put the steering mount back on the boat. Attach it with your 1/4 inch hex. Now you can feed the cranks through the H-rail, and you can reach in here and grab the compression tube, and you're able to push up on the compression tube, which helps you to feed the cranks through the H-rail. You can see I can control it from here. I don't have to reach all the way in. Next step is going to be to take the mount cover and feed it over the top of the H-rail, and then make sure I can get all of the system through, both of the cranks. So I'll go ahead and screw the screws back onto the steering mount. To attach the handles, push up on the compression tube until you can see both of the cranks. And you're going to want to line the detents up on the rudder cranks so that one of the detents is facing the front of the boat and one is facing the back. And then with the handle facing forwards, slide it over both of these cranks. You may find that you need to use this pin to pull up a bit on the 360 crank to fully seat the rudder crank in place. Once you have the pin installed, just place the 360 crank over the top of it, put the screw in place, and then again reach in through the rectangular hatch and press up on the compression tube, which just makes sure that the cranks are fully extending and that you'll be able to thread this onto the crank. Once that's tight, go ahead and replace the decal. The last step is to attach the back end of the 8-trail to the gunnel. Now that you have the steering box and compression tube installed, again, double check that you have the black mark on the compression tube facing directly up, and then make sure that it's seated into the steering box. You can do that by pulling with your thumb on the belt while pressing back on the tube, and then make sure that this compression tube spacer is fully seated into the steering box. Now we're going to take these two clamshell pieces. Again, these have pulley wheels and axles in place. You're going to take this drum and place it onto the belt. You want to make sure when you do this that you don't end up with slack on the backside of the belt here. You want to make sure it's fully seated onto the belt. So just run your fingers around the edge and then visually inspect it. Once you have that in place, you're going to want to take the half of the clamshell with the pulleys and the pulley axles and the hole, the large hole through the center, and feed that on from the bottom side. I find that it helps to pinch the belt as you're putting it in place to feed it between those pulleys. There's a little slot for this compression tube spacer. You can see on this one. Just want to make sure that that slots into place. Next step is to put the top half of the clamshell on. And I find it helps to angle it first to get this axle lined up. And then if you have trouble lining up the other axle, just take a flathead screwdriver and just poke that pulley just a little bit, and it'll help it to line up, and the axle will drop into that hole. Once you have that in place, just go ahead and screw both of these 7/64 hexes into position. It's important to hold everything together while you're doing this because there's a chance that it could fall apart. Keep in mind you're screwing these into plastic, so just tighten them until they're snug. Okay, next step is to put the clutch assembly onto the steering assembly. And again, like last time, we're going to rotate this just slightly. You don't want to twist this completely because as this twists, it's twisting that aluminum compression tube spacer with it. So just twist this out a little bit for access. And then you're going to want to line up this detent here with the hole between these springs. So what I would do is just first feed this axle through the hole in the gear and then rotate this around until it locks into place. And then by hand with my thumb, I can just twist this part. Then I want to just pull up on this, make sure everything's snug together. You can tell that this is seating properly because there isn't a big gap here. Now that's ready for the well to be assembled onto it. To assemble the well onto the boat and the clutch, just go ahead and make sure you have your 3 screws already in place. And be careful as you're pushing the well down onto the boat. There's a chance you could hit this and push the clutch system out of place. So what I do when I'm assembling this is I just start feeding it over, and then I take my fingers and I pull up on this piece to make sure it stays seated as I push down on the well. And the last step is to make sure that the axle for the clutch fits through the hole on the well. Now that that's in place, you can see I'm still holding this up with my fingers. I start these 2 screws. And once those are fed into the holes, the clutch won't move anymore and you don't have to hold it. It's easiest to tighten these screws first, and you can be sure that the clutch is going to stay in place. So I always tighten these first. To properly adjust these 2 bolts, you're going to want to tighten the rear bolt until it's tight, and then back it off a turn and a half. This rear bolt controls the position of this gear compared to the drive, and that gives it a little bit of room so that when the drive goes in place, the gear that's on the drive doesn't have too much tension against this surface. The front bolt, you're going to want to tension until it's tight, and then back it off a half turn. The front bolt is what's called the clutch slip. What that allows is if you were to hit something hard with the drive or drag the boat backwards on the sand, it allows the whole system to slip with the drive in place. So we'll tune this, and then once the boat's on the water, if you find that the drive is walking by itself as you're pedaling, it's going left and right, you can just put another quarter turn on that bolt and it'll help to keep the drive in position. Now I'm going to go ahead and tighten 3 bolts on the well. Find it's easiest to start with the back one. And I don't tighten any of them completely until I get them all in place. Sometimes you need to wiggle the drive well back and forth a little bit to get them to line up, but it's not normally too difficult. Okay, all 3 of them are lined up. Snug them down. Again, don't have to be too tight. Now that you have the whole steering assembly back in the boat, you just need to replace the 2 pieces of foam. And these are here because they're load-bearing for support when you stand on the kayak. This one has a little cutout you can see for the compression tube. So feed this back into place, put this one back into the gunnel of the boat, and put the 2 screws in place. Now that you have everything installed, the last step is to attach the steering lines front and back to the rudder crank. And once that's in place, you just need to tune the system. So there's a separate video for the compression tube for tightening the belt, and then there's another video for the clutch if you have any issues with the tension on the clutch.